Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. And this is an exciting episode because we're nearly wrapping up the season. This platform is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I encourage you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be accessed on our website. I am Siseko Khumalo, your host, a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program and a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. Today, I am joined by my mentor, advisor, and director of the Center for African Studies at Harvard University, Professor Akyeampong, who joined the history faculty at Harvard upon receiving his PhD in African history from the University of Virginia in 1993. I wasn't even born at the time. He received his master's degree at Wake Forest University in North Carolina in 1989, where he concentrated on English labor history, and his bachelor's degree in history and religions from the University of Ghana at Legon in 1984. Professor Akyeampong's publications include Themes in West Africa's History, which was published in 2005, which he edited, Independent Africa, the First Generation of Nation Builders, published in 2023, Between the Sea and the Lagoon, an eco-social history of the Anlo of southeastern Ghana, 1850 to recent times, and Drink, Power and Cultural Change, a social history of alcohol in Ghana, 1800 to present times. He was a co-chief editor with Henry Louis Gates Jr. for the Dictionary of African Biography, Volume 6 in 2012. Professor Akyeampong has been awarded several research fellowships, and from 1993 to 1994, he was the Zora Neale Hurston Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study and Research in the African Humanities at Northwestern University, and was named a corresponding fellow of the Royal Historical Society in 2002. In 2018, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws by the University of Ghana. At Harvard University, Professor Akyeampong is a faculty associate for the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and a member of the executive committee of the Hutchins Center. As a former chair of the Committee on African Studies, he's been instrumental, along with Professor Gates, in creating the Department of African and African American Studies. He currently serves as the Oppenheimer Faculty Director of the Center for African Studies. Professor Akyeampong, that is an incredibly exciting and illustrious biography. I want to begin with sort of a brief, maybe, sketch of how it is. Of course, we understand from your bio, but how did you land up in the Center for African Studies, and really what that meant for you when you came into the role? Because part of what we're trying to do as well in this conversation is to also think about the fact that at the moment you are preparing to step down as the director, which of course for a lot of us is a bittersweet moment. We're excited for the new prospects that are coming up, but we're also incredibly saddened by the fact that you will be leaving the hot seat, but you leave it in an incredible position. So I'm just curious about that, to say you took over the directorship of the center a couple of years ago, and what it was that sort of brought you to that, and what was the vision behind coming into the role?
I've actually had the privilege of chairing African Studies at Harvard on two separate occasions. The first was between 2002 in 2006. And it followed a little crisis in African studies, which had resulted in the departure of two very important faculty members, Cornel West to Princeton and Anthony Appiah to Princeton. Cornell based on some tensions between him and Harvard president Lawrence Summers. I happened to be on sabbatical then. And I received an email from Lawrence Summers that, in thinking about who should chair African Studies, because Anthony Appiah was the chair. And with his departure, they were looking for a chair. And he pointed out that, your colleagues suggest I talk to you. And I guess because I was absent, I couldn't speak for myself. So I returned as chair, and I was asked to provide a vision for, let's say, 3 to 6 years, because these are 3-year appointments.
Yes.
And my vision, I think, privileged 3 things. One, I explained that for us to be a serious program that trains people in Africa, we must have a robust African languages program. And that I would like to design one for the university. The second, we used to have what used to be a certificate in African studies, which was kind of lightweight. So I suggested that I would like to replace that with a degree in African studies. And then the third was something that I called the Africa Initiative, which was an inter-school, interdisciplinary research agenda on Africa that looked at like 5 key areas, and it was supposed to be the nucleus for a Center for African Studies. So the president and the dean for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences liked that, but they said to do that requires that we elevate the Committee on African Studies from what at Harvard is called a coordinating committee to be an instructional committee, one that offers instruction and gives degrees.
Yes.
But we're not sure whether we want to do that at this moment. So why don't you and your friend Henry Louis Gates sit down and see if you want to transform Afro-Am into African and African-American studies. And if the university approves, then you can put the language program you design there. You can put the undergraduate degree there, and we will give you a number of hiring positions to hire faculty who work on Africa. So, the language program, which you've seen,
Yes.
African and African-American Studies, which you came through, and then the Africa Initiative became the nucleus for the Center for African Studies in 2014. So you have seen the 3 components
Working
flourishing.
together. Yes.
And then in 2016, again, I'm called in and said, your colleagues say we should ask you.
Yes.
Again, a little crisis had preceded that. And the center had been, for about half a year, was put in the unusual position that it was co-chaired in an interim status by the dean of the dean of social sciences and the vice provost for international affairs. So in a sense, they held it, I guess, in custodianship or whatever you want to call it, in a period of transition. So again, what will you do to build African studies? So now we're speaking 10 years after my first period. And I came at the time when the paradigm of area studies had come into question. And so it was a time to reimagine what African studies should look like. So this time what has been exciting has been to forge an intellectual vision about what African studies should be like. If I can speak briefly to the concept of area studies. So in the 50s and the 60s, as Africa is decolonized, and you have independent African countries, France, Britain, Portugal, they had colonies. So there was a sense in which they had a colonial archive. They understood the colonies. And they have done censuses for many years. They knew the people. They had done studies of flora and fauna. They had done geological surveys. They knew what was underground. They had done hydrological surveys. The U.S. lacked that kind of understanding. But it had become an important supporter of the West through the Marshall Plan,
Yes.
which had rebuilt
Yes.
the West after
Yes.
World War II. And it felt that one of its just deserves was to have access to a global market, including the former colonies that used to be the backyards of metropolitan colonial powers. But it lacked an understanding of these places. So that is how area studies emerged. As a State Department initiative, later it would be farmed out to the Department of Education. So the Area Studies Center brought scholars from different disciplines together. Anthropology, languages, history, political science. It was almost trying to create a composite understanding of regions by bringing these individuals together. So area studies and how African studies emerged in the United States emerged as a product of U.S. interest in Africa.
Yes.
Not necessarily of Africans defining how their continent should be studied. By the time we got to the 2000s and the move towards global history, this, that, people were wondering, okay, is area studies and the paradigm still relevant? And so this time around, I'll highlight a couple of things. One, that you could not build an outstanding Center for African Studies divorced from the continent that you study.
Yes.
In that our understanding of Africa, our research agenda, our teaching agenda should be informed through dialogue with African institutions, with African practitioners. That is one of the reasons behind the office in Johannesburg, which I have described as our listening post. That is how we are part of conversations in which we come in humility, not to set an agenda, but to listen. So what is important to you guys? What is going on now? What is happening in your disciplines? Because the intellectual agenda at Harvard cannot be different from the intellectual agenda on the continent. So that was one. And then the second thing I did was perhaps to take the center beyond the usual pillars of area studies. So science and technology came in. Public health came in. Business and entrepreneurship came in. And for my colleagues, you're becoming something that is different from our understanding of a Center for African Studies. But I did that also in conversation with colleagues and policymakers and governments in Africa to understand that these are the areas of concern for them. Climate change, this, that. Understanding migration, understanding what is happening to the environment and biodiversity. You cannot be divorced from these critical
debates. And so does that, what I'm sort of picking up there is the fact that the Center for African Studies becomes sort of a public-facing institution in a way that is responsive. Knowledge becomes, and knowledge production in the Center for African Studies at Harvard University becomes knowledge that is purposed for the African continent, for the people on the continent, for their governments, for their NGO sectors, for energy crises, for you name it.
And their concerns informs the kind of research we do here and how we teach. So it becomes
a dialogical exchange.
Which is what has informed even the mission statement of the center. This is where Harvard and Africa
meet. Absolutely. And it's interesting, Prof, that you sort of start off with the tracing of the history of African studies, because, and also the history of African studies broadly in the United States, but also the history of African studies at Harvard University, having sort of given rise to the African language program. Wonderfully enough, we've had, two interesting colleagues of yours and seniors of mine, both Professor John Mugane and Professor Paul Zaleza. Professor Mugane, who is the director of the African Language Program here at Harvard University, and Professor Zaleza, who's sort of really been a towering figure in African studies, both in the United States but also on the African continent. And he raises precisely this point, which is to say, there are three sort of intellectual periodical shifts in African studies in the United States. You've got the Du Boisian sort of approach that says, okay, we are interested in studying Africa for the purposes of sort of bootstrapping, sort of picking ourselves up by the bootstraps as African Americans, understanding the civilizations of Africa. Then it moves off to the second iterative move, area studies, where it becomes, as you say, this entryway of the US into the continent, which is to say, how do we understand the continent? How do we respond to the continent? And this sort of brings me to, it anticipates, I suppose, where I hope our conversation will end up. The question of, in those three iterative moves, and now there's this sort of dialogical spin that's happening between the United States as well as the African continent. I'm curious about what the future of African studies in the US looks like. And this is asked precisely because of, I think, the innovation of setting up, an office on the continent in Johannesburg. That this is the first center across the globe. You've got the Oxford Center for African Studies. You've got, I believe the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London is attempting to set up a center as well at this point in time. But Harvard was the first, I think, globally, and I might be mistaken,
in sub-Saharan Africa,
to set up an office. And I'm interested in that to say, as that move happens, as academics on the continent, as you say, we have our own agenda. We are setting our own agenda. And it's also fascinating that that this particular office is in Johannesburg, with South Africa being the most capacitated university sector on the continent in terms of infrastructure, resources, etc., etc. So what becomes the relationship of intellectuals on the continent, channeling information through sort of the metropoles of Africa, right? And here I'm thinking Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. These are sort of the big spaces, cultural metropolises, really, cultural generation and innovation. And that's not to downplay everybody else, but fundamentally, when we're thinking culture, we're thinking of these sites, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, with a bit of Kenya, in fact, actually. Let me not be so pompous as to exclude Kenya from this discussion. But what becomes the future of collaboration when there is precisely this dialogical shift that is, I find fascinating because, again, it's a first. Historically, it's always been the North sets the agenda and we as the South accept. Whereas now it's sort of a together, in conversation, in community, we're setting the agenda. So what becomes the future, I wonder?
I can enter through a couple of different points. So you talked about the relevance of South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana, and you threw in Kenya. And I have told my colleagues here that our engagement with Africa cannot be framed by an Anglophone perspective. And that we need to go beyond that.
Yes.
And I've begun to make efforts this year. Unfortunately, the intervention of COVID meant that we lost substantially 2020, 2021, and 2022. So I've encouraged Harvard, through the Center for African Studies, to engage the Francophone and the Lusophone world. There are 54, 55 countries.
On the continent.
In sub-Saharan Africa, there are 48 plus. So how do you choose so that your your unit of engagement has heuristical analytical value. So I decided or recommended that let's use the Congo Basin as our way to engage. It's the second most important river in the world. Its forest competes with the Amazon in terms of its climate solving effects. These are called the carbon sinks of humanity. That region has some of the most important strategic minerals when we think about clean energy and our transition from copper through cobalt, through coltan, through lithium, and I can go on and go on and go on. And they give us countries on the north and the south bank of the Congo who are both francophone and lusophone. So I said, let's take two. Let's take the DRC, which has a fascinating history.
Yes.
And let's take Angola, so that we have one major French-speaking country, one major Portuguese-speaking country as our point of entry. And so January I visited DRC. March I was supposed to go to Angola from South Africa, but I had a lot of work to do in South Africa, especially since March was my last official visit, and I had just too much outstanding work. So I will forward the recommendation to visit with Angola. And we've received a number of delegations from Angola. So that conversation has begun. We have not gone there. And for me, as a historian, I don't write about places I haven't seen and walked. And also, as a faculty director, places that I build bridges. I go myself.
Yes.
And so we are beginning to think even differently about how we engage in terms of our regions. We are also even thinking differently in terms of, I think, theory making, which is, I know, something that is of great importance to you. Is very much at the center of how we're thinking about African studies. My colleague, the Komarovs, wrote theory from the South, and it was looking at how Africa has become a vantage point from which to theorize about capitalism and liberal democratic movements and things, but from the global South. But this is an important book, but it was written very much with the North in mind. So though it's theory from the South and for the South, it is almost aimed at the Northern.
In terms of audience.
Yes, audience. And these are, I mean, you have looked at decoloniality and the African archive, the Black archive. Exactly how one brings the production of knowledge in Africa side by side with the production of knowledge in the West is a pivot to one means a dismissal of the other, not necessarily. How are they brought into conversations? And for me, theory making is important. And in the middle of that, our concerns of decoloniality. Many of our disciplines, anthropology, forest science, even if we go to the Mogul, emerge within the context of empire. 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. Because as the West turned to non-Western places, they also went with the assumption that societies can be reduced to a set of knowable facts. And once you can do that and you can master that, you can rule anyone, anywhere. I talked about the census.
Yes.
study of flora and fauna, ethnology, past material culture, ethnography and anthropology, the place of museums, this, that. There's an important book by Bernard Kuhn on India, and the title is Colonialism and Its Forms of Knowledge. And it looks at the process by which the British came to understand India through these production of facts. And once you have that and you've mastered that, then you think you can rule. You know a place, you know its people. This would be extended to Africa. And I think Helen Tilley in Africa as a Living Laboratory shows how scientific knowledge was applied in the endeavor to know Africa during colonial rule. These paradigms still frame our disciplines. So as a historian, two Europeans were very much at the beginnings of history as an academic discipline. They were both Germans, Leopold von Ranke, and how we understand history, Niebuhr, and how we footnote and reference in there. But they believed that history was an archive-based discipline, which privileges also writing.
Yes.
So when you go to Africa, where your archive is a colonial archive generated during colonialism, and you're a historian, which is a history, is an archive-centered discipline. How do you write about Africa in ways that are empowering, in which the African perspective is privileged, African ways of knowing, African ways of understanding? So these are important. Okay. Theory is how we understand what is around us and take responsibility of our fate. My brother Achille Mbembe will talk about theory as how the West domesticates contingency. It enables you to unpack power structures. It enables you to imagine alternative social arrangements. You know? So there's something. Theory making is like liberatory work. And Africans cannot be outside
of that process.
We've also had these disciplines that have framed us.
Yes.
So what do we do with those disciplines? You're a philosopher. You've had to read the masters
Of philosophy.
So I have always talked about the importance of mastering the masters and then transcending the masters.
Yes.
Because otherwise, even when you write in terms of your scholarship, you write for small audiences. If you're writing for an international audience and you're a philosopher or you're a historian or you're an anthropologist, they will look at your footnotes to see if you've done your...
If you've mastered your masters.
And when you have, and you say, but let me show you this way of thinking about something, and you open a different window, then you're taken seriously. And then they listen to you. So theory making, decoloniality, the Black Archive, other archives that are not the sort of orthodox normal, all of these are very connected in finding African voices and African perspectives. And I believe that with the continent, 60% of the unfarmed arable land in the world is in Africa. When you talk about the importance, minerals and the like, when you talk about population, come 2050, 1 out of every 4 people working on the earth is an African. Africa is at the center of the world. We just need to
leverage.
Tell ourselves.
Yes.
believe that and then ask ourselves, what does that mean? So, one of my hats is as a theologian and as an ordained minister. And in the last year, I've had a series of, we call them faith and life lessons at Memorial Church. And one, we looked at Christianity in Ghana, and we looked at pilgrimage in Ghana to holy mountains, prayer sites. And then the second, which we did in April, we looked at Islam and Senegal and the emergence of holy places and traveling for religious purposes. And I asked my congregants, who are mostly Americans or white, that the continent with the largest population of Christians today is Africa. The largest number of Muslims are in South Asia. The second largest number of Muslims are found on the continent of Africa. What are the implications for these two universal faiths? That Africa becomes the face that defines the faith. And my congregants look at me because they've never thought about that. So in many areas, Africa's place has shifted. For the significance of that to be apparent, we need to do theory work.
Yes.
Drawing on multiple archives, multiple libraries.
And Professor, I'm curious about two things that you mentioned. The first is to say, and you mentioned my own work in the fact that I work in decoloniality, and part of what often comes up in the debates of decoloniality is the notion of delinking. And that necessarily comes from the Latin American tradition, which I don't necessarily quite privilege myself, because I believe that there needs to be continuous conversation. One cannot be recognized as a philosopher without having had mastered, the likes of Immanuel Kant, the likes of Friedrich Hegel, the likes of, Martin Heidegger in ontology and phenomenology. There are all of these characters, and one is still talking about the Germans. One can go over, and speak in phenomenology still to Merleau-Ponty, to Jean-Paul Sartre. You are not a philosopher if you have not mastered those cats. And then, of course, the tradition that is most apparent in this country is the analytic tradition, which is the English tradition. So again, the English themselves have their own masters. So the notion of delinking, I think, is short-sighted in the sense that it forecloses our ability to train our students to be globally conversant within the disciplines. And you also mentioned the notion of theory making as a way of sort of getting us to this point to say, how does the West and Africa, or how does the West and the South coexist together in ways that, again, are generative theoretically, because that's what we want as intellectuals. Insularity and parochialism is unfortunately very, very limited and very, very limiting. So I'm curious about the conversation that processes of dialogue have facilitated. And there have been a number of iterative moments in this, and you have been one of the most instrumental individuals in doing this at Harvard University, where you have situated the continent in conversation with her diasporic communities in the Americas. So I'm fascinated by that relationship and what it means. Because, and you guys are getting older. You might look very young, but you don't have another 60 years in the ticker, as it were. And I find myself a bit worried, because if we take seriously the discussions that you folks were having in the early 2000s, and even prior to that, in the 90s and in the 80s, you mention towering figures in the context of the United States, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Cornel West, Professor Henry Louis Gates. These are characters that define or become definitive when we are thinking about African studies. We are thinking of you guys. Professor Emmanuel Akyeampong, Paul Zaleza, Kwame Anthony Appiah. These are the names that we are thinking about. And I fear that the intercontinental dialogue seems to have come to a halt with your generation. Now, is there work that we are attempting to do? There is. For example, last week, I spoke to a good colleague of mine on this very platform, Darian Pollock, and we were thinking precisely about these questions. And he's another young, assistant professor at Boston University, he's a graduate of Harvard University, completed his PhD with us, with Harvard a couple of moons ago. And we were sort of thinking about exactly this, to say, how do we meet each other as an African philosopher, as an American philosopher? So we are attempting to have those discussions. But there was a concerted effort in the 2000s, I believe, irrespective of the fact that there might have been, challenges that resulted, for example, in the departure of Kwame Anthony Appiah and or Cornel West from Harvard University. The fact of the matter was there was a concerted conversation that was happening and was cultivated. And those conversations, irrespective of the fact that the colleagues now are in other institutions, continue to happen. Yeah. So I suppose in a very roundabout way, my concern here is to say, how do we, as the younger generation of intellectuals, continue the work that you folks started? Because at the end of the day, we also don't want to seem to be inventing a new wheel, because the wheel is already there. We just need to attach it to a machine and oil up the machine, grease it up and have it running again, because the machine did run historically. So what do you make of the current situation in terms of the intellectual discourse and dialogue between African American, especially in the context, for example, of the department in which we are located, AAAS, Africa and African American Studies? Is there a dialogical bridge between these traditions? And if not, how do we strengthen it? Or even if there is, how in fact do we strengthen it here?
You raise an important question. It's a question that has been a perennial one in African and African American studies, not just at Harvard, around. When we decided to create African and African American studies around 2002, colleagues around the world, especially in the US, asked me, why are you doing this and why are you doing this now? Because this experiment has been questioned in other places. Because where they have been created, the ability of the two fields to merge intellectually sometimes have been challenging. And then it looks like you're together only because of the affinity of skin color. So one of the things I had to argue on the floor of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences was why there was an intellectual rationale for creating African and African American studies. In 2000, African Affairs, one of the oldest African journals, commissioned me for its centenary issue to write a piece on Africa and the diaspora. My short email to the editors is that I don't work on the diaspora. Their short response is that you live
in the diaspora.
And you are trained in such a way that if you put your mind to it, you write something original. Eventually, I accepted the challenge. So I wrote a piece in 2000 called Africans in the Diaspora and Africa, which is probably one of the most cited, I think it's clearly the most cited article I've ever written. And what I was intrigued by was the intersection between the old diaspora, which originated in forced migration, so the slave trade.
Yes.
and the new diaspora, which is properly called transnationalism, individuals like myself, and how these two have intersected. The new diaspora is comfortable migrating to areas where the old diaspora is present. Even if they are African Americans, we take comfort that we share color.
Yes.
But we have these recent immigrant communities that have built. If you go to Worcester, which is the second largest city in Massachusetts, Ghanaians have become so significant that if you want to be mayor of Worcester, you need to go and campaign among the Ghanaians. They have over a dozen grocery shops, they have their restaurants, they have their small businesses, there are several Ghanaian churches, to the point that from the mid-1990s, political parties, we moved to multi-party politics, now you have to, the definition of polity had extended to incorporate the diaspora. Lobbying for funding for your party. Now, party hopefuls come to Canada, come to the US, to go to Europe.
Yes.
Meet party branches in that. So I was intrigued by this expansion in our understanding of polity, of politics, of economics, because remittances became significant. And then you begin to encourage them to send back more money. Then they began to come up with something called brain circulation, of which my friend Paul Zaleza is one of the leading advocates, that instead of seeing it as brain drain. Brain circulate. So at some point in time in the 90s, the Embassy of Ghana actually created what they call a brain bank, appealing to Ghanaians to register and to indicate which weeks or months in the year that we are willing and available to spend a little time in Ghana helping in capacity building, because they had come to appreciate that brains
can move
circulate
between spaces.
and
yes.
that, in fact, our time here maybe has even made us more valuable. If you are a nuclear physicist, I don't know how many labs in Africa
have nuclear physicists.
So this is okay. So there was that. But out of these conversations and flows, even came the importance of dual citizenship, because those in the diaspora said, "Well, if we're going to be sending money back, the reason I have this wonderful job here is because I'm naturalized. But you say that I cannot be both. So I have had to give up my Ghanaian citizenship or my South African citizenship.
In order to
But if you want us to invest, then
open up the opportunity for us to be
to
citizens.
be both. To be both. So you can see how transnationalism have opened up all these questions. Then we used to assume that outside places like South Africa and Zimbabwe and Kenya, race was not an issue in Africa. I stand corrected. And I've seen how the concept of global blackness, for example, something I've written about before, seemed to have brought together people of color across the world. Look at how hip-hop was domesticated across the world in various versions, not because the beat is interesting, but the context
And the culture.
it emerged out of, and the culture and the context that it speaks to, all these are paralleled. Black Lives Matter became something that had very local nuance. South Africa, in Kenya, in NSAS in Nigeria. There's global blackness, there's global anti or anti-blackness. All of these are framed discourses in ways that I'm beginning to appreciate race as an important factor in societies for which I thought race was not important. Let me tell you an interesting story. So in, I think, 96, I was on sabbatical in Ghana. And my professor from University of Virginia came to visit me with his wife. And you know, Ghana has the densest concentration of forts and castles from the gold trade, slave trade. So I took them to see Cape Coast Castle and Mina Castle and a few lesser known. So we stopped at one that is called Kromanting or Fort Amsterdam. Went to the fort, came to the beach, and then my professor wanted to take a photograph. And then the fishermen and quickly came and said, "You cannot do that." I listened to the conversation because this was a very unusual thing. And they explained that, a few white people came, they took pictures of us. And we found the pictures in media of which we were not happy. So we are uneasy.
When someone brings a camera.
And wants to take a picture of us. So race, the representation of people, had all showed up in this little fishing town on the coast of Ghana in 1996. So I listened them out, and then I switched to Tree. And I said, okay, this is who I am. This is the elderly gentleman I went to study. I am back in Ghana. He has come to visit me with his wife. They said, "Oh, that's the wife." I said, "Okay." Because the wife looked a little young. I said, "That's the wife." It is my pleasure to show him
my home.
So this is not somebody who's taking pictures and you show it in a magazine. No.
So it's not a parachute reporter.
And then they say, he can't take the pictures. So race issues have become, because once we began to have the CNNs and the
BBCs
and the BETs and it began to socialize as a globe. We began to see the same images and hear the same sounds. And it meant that issues that we considered over there,
distant, foreign, removed,
ceased to be. And then people began to, we talk about globalization. And globalization essentially also facilitates the flow of capital and the flow of labor. Capital goes everywhere. But globalization is also marked by blockages. So Europeans and North Americans may easily come to Africa. They don't even need a visa to enter to South Africa. The opposite is not true. Okay. And so as we begin to see also these communities growing of Westerners in Africa, someone who was born free, so did not see colonialism in Ghana, is struck as a 20-year-old when you go to downtown Accra and you see that most of the businesses are expatriate owned. And then you begin to wonder, maybe this is what colonialism looked like. When everything that was valuable was owned by people who are white. So all of a sudden, these conversations that would have appeared foreign are beginning to have resonance in ways that people did not imagine. my last example, then I'll stop. Maybe sometime in the late 1990s, we went to a concert at the International Theatre in Accra. It was a hip life concert, which was the Ghanaian version of hip hop. And there were many artists and this and that. And what I found intriguing, I had my in-laws who had come from New Jersey and the rest. And so we went together. And they were, they saw folks dressed like New York or LA and the whatever, and they expressed disappointment that the Ghana we know is not this.
Yeah. It's modernizing too quickly.
Well, it is, I guess, going... What they were seeing was African-American culture writ large. And I listened to them, and I said, okay, you have migrated to the U.S. to be a beneficiary of globalization. They are also imagining globalization in their own ways.
Yes.
And though they may not have traveled, the imaginary is a powerful medium of transformation in terms of self and identity. So why do you want them to remain as is? For you to come back and have the comfort of saying, this is the Ghana I left, or this is the Ghana I missed. So I'll end there.
Now, in view of some of the, and this is, it sort of draws parts to what we were just talking about now, which is to say that the world is modernizing, it's changing. Africa is in Europe and in North America and in South America, and all of these parts are also in China, in Russia.
Yeah.
And all these parts are also
in Africa.
In Africa.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what that means in terms of two things. The first is the current historical moment as a historian. I ask that question as a historian. But also, as a result of the world becoming so much smaller because of globalization, we're beginning to see critical and problematic and even scary attacks on critical thought. And this is not something that's only an issue in terms of the United States. And the case of Florida is, everybody talks about the case of Florida. Books are being banned, school boards are being advised on what to teach and what not to teach, etc., etc. I'm fascinated what this means then for the role of the contemporary African intellectual. And we see this on the continent as well, where, during the Zuma years, for example, in South Africa, which is what I'm most familiar with, black intellectuals were told that we were clever blacks when we questioned changes around institutional governance, the flouting and the deracination of, democratic institutions in the country. We were told you're being clever blacks. Real blacks, behave in a particular kind of way. So this is not an issue that is only, particular or seen in the United States in the case of attacks on critical race theory. It happens across the globe, where intellectuals are told not to think in the contexts of nationalist governments that are pushing particular agendas. So I suppose with that, the question that I then have is to say, what does that mean for the contemporary historical moment? And what does it mean for the role of the contemporary African intellectual?
So let me speak about Africa. Maybe I'll speak a bit about Africans in the diaspora, and the connection between the two. In the 60s, some of the most important conferences on Africa were taking place in Africa. As independent African governments put the resources and invited international scholars
to come and lead debates.
To set an agenda for African studies. Ghana was important, and Nkrumah had one of the perhaps first Africa-based African Studies International Conferences in which everybody from Heskovitz through the Darrell Fords and the people from everybody came. This was connected to when Du Bois had moved to Ghana. And Du Bois had brought a project, the Encarta Africana, which was going to be based in Ghana. Nkrumah would open the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. The speech he gave at the opening of that institute reveals his vision about what African studies would be and what role it would play in the building of a new nation. You can go and read some of the what is described as the 6th Pan-African Congress or Conference was held in Dar es Salaam. Before that, Nyerere had hosted a number of conferences at the University of Dar es Salaam where Africans in the diaspora and in Africa had met to think about Africa on the continent, Africans outside. Okay. By the time we get to the 70s, Africa's economies had become distressed. And the oil crisis in the 70s did not help. The crisis in 73, 74.
Yeah.
There was another one around 78, 79. Before 1979, in sub-Saharan Africa, only one country had gone to the IMF for a stabilization package before 1979. That was Ghana after Nkrumah's overthrow. Between 1980 and 1985, 33 African countries lined up at the World Bank for structural adjustment programs. When I went to college in the University of Ghana in the 1980s, the books were not in the library anymore. There might be one copy for a class of 80. And you get there and you find out that somebody had torn the relevant pages
out.
We were dependent on our notes from our lecturers. When I showed up at the University of Virginia, I would find books that I had heard of but never seen. And that became the beginnings of my own quest too.
And curiosity, the satiation of this curiosity, yes.
It got to a point I was reading a book a day. I had a big hole.
Yes, yes.
So in the 1980s, African universities declined in stature. In the 70s, if you were an American or a European scholar of African studies, for you to prove your credentials, you had to teach at an African institution. So Terence Ranger, Leroy Vale, and I can continue mentioning, they are taught in places like Zambia and Zimbabwe, University of Ghana, University of Lagos, or Ibadan, and this and that. Then you'll be respected when you came back. The important journals were journals like the Transactions of the Historical Society of Ghana, Transactions of the Historical Society of Nigeria. By the time we enter into the 80s and the 90s,
all of that is gone.
And African scholars lost their voice. This is when the IMF and the World Bank became hegemonic. And experts came from the West.
Yes.
To consult for our governments. we're still trying to reverse that with countries at different phases. So it is in the 80s especially, some places late 70s, that you begin to see Africans go to study outside. I came to do African history in the U.S. It would have made sense for me to do African history on the continent. So we are still struggling to find our voice on the continent. At that point in time, the major journals ceased to be transactions of the Historical Society of Ghana. Ghana University's press became a weak press. Later it would be resuscitated, but it didn't attract the kind of books that
it used to.
Now even they would tell you to make sure your
Publications are in the north.
international. So the ways in which we even evaluate the value of scholarship has changed. And somehow we need to, because society, government, private sector, academia are connected. And when academia ceases to be the engine that makes sense of a society, that equips and critiques its government, that fuels the imagination and provides personnel for the private sector, then there's a disconnect. We have a graduate unemployment problem. But jobs are also telling us they cannot fill positions, and that the available material is not
corresponding.
So that part we still need to face. And then there are some of us who found ourselves here. And one of the things that Paul Zaleza did based on his research was a project that Carnegie Corporation came to fund called the Carnegie Africa Diaspora Fellows Program. So we decided to see if African-born scholars who had moved to North America, not asking them to return, but in the summers,
To
can be for 2 weeks up to 90 days, if you are funded. Let's see how we can build. Let's go and help build programs. Let's go train. Let's go.
Yes.
And so that has been one of the most successful programs I served on this advisory council, to find ways in which those who moved out can be part of the rebuilding of capacity. It is important for African institutions, governments, and scholars to set the priorities of their intellectual agenda. I think we find ourselves, when your confidence is dented, which is what happened in the 80s and the 90s, it got to a point that the government might bring in consultants from McKinsey.
Yes.
Than go to its Department of Economics. When it gets to that point,
There's a problem.
And how to correct that, it's not easy. And somehow we need to correct that. Otherwise, I like the World Bank and I like the IMF. There's nothing wrong with them. But it's gotten to a point that the body of knowledge they have created is shaping our understanding of the political economy of our continent. When we come to the 60s, the IMF and the World Bank knew nothing about Africa. So how do they become the oracles or the hegemonic sources of knowledge?
Yes.
Now we talk about how post-COVID, COVID taught countries that globalization has its limits. If the United States could not find PPE, and we had to go to China to get your mask, then the outsourcing of production and industrialization had shown you that it has limitations and it has problems. So economists like Danny Roderick, who are international economists, are suggesting that in the post-COVID era, countries will go back to being more domestic and security conscious. Make sure that certain areas of production are done at home.
So as to protect.
They don't want to be caught in that situation again.
Yes.
When a country like the U.S. does not have enough ventilators. When, I don't even want to go into this situation in Africa. So if countries are going to redefine their agendas, we are in a continent in which our economic objectives are set by the World Bank. Our money comes. So the World Bank and the IMF are players in the game. They are referees
Of the game that
they bought the ball we are playing with. And for me, all of that is, I value them. But how do we get back to that place where governments and scholars from a country and private sector get together and set their own priorities and set
without international pressure?
And decide when we need this from outside and when we are fine. And so we find ourselves in that place. And you cannot understand the predicament without factoring historically what happened in the 70s and the 80s and the loss of academic voices.
Absolutely. Prof, as a concluding thought, as a way of sort of coming back to this notion of revitalizing the agency of Africa and Africans and African intellectuals, earlier on you spoke about some of the objections maybe, or some of the challenges that came up when, work was being done here at Harvard to establish the Department of African and African American Studies. I'm intrigued by, I suppose every era has its own sort of problems, as it were. And as a result, as academics, if we're good enough, we attempt to respond to those problems. Good colleagues of ours, for example, the newly minted professor of education and African American Studies, Jarvis Givens, in the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard, is working, for example, to establish with colleagues at Northwestern University an area of research called Black Educational Studies. And it's fascinating, and I'm pained at the fact that I couldn't get my colleague on this platform, because there's a lot of useful collaborative work or the conversation, I think, could have been really, really generative. And I'm trying to, for example, establish Black archival studies as an area of research. What is your impression of the impact that such disciplinary areas can make in the study of Black life across the globe? And thinking about, before we came on air today, we were talking about a paper of mine that you had read, and you had indicated that it needs to be opened up a bit more, in the sense of it draws from a particular case study, which is the South African context, but in order for it to speak to a wider audience, it needs to demonstrate the importance of the case study nature, but while also demonstrating how it can contribute to global discourses. So I'm balancing precisely that critique and that objection, which I find incredibly generative and useful, because on the one hand, as we establish these areas, we don't want to find ourselves being parochial and provincial. And America, on the other hand, has the capacity of establishing these areas with the parochialism and provincialism because of its cultural hegemony. So I think the question that I'm thinking about is to say, we've spoken about precisely the project of agenda setting on the African continent, agenda setting in conversation with colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic, and all over the world for that matter, because it's not just the United States that has an African diaspora. You know, you've got folks in Brazil, you've got folks in South America, you've got folks in the West Indies, in Jamaica, you know, you name it. In order for us to speak to that global blackness, as I say, my colleague Jarvis Givens is attempting to establish black educational studies, and I, on the other hand, am attempting to establish black archival studies. What is your impression in terms of, are we being responsive to contemporary socio-political conditions, and how do we do that, as I say, without the handicap? And both of us, by the way, an American and a South African, could very easily be handicapped by playing into the cultural parochialisms of our contexts, because we have an air of exceptionalism, as it were. America, South Africa, slavery, apartheid, you name it, you know? So how do we do this work of not falling into those trappings as we try and respond as new age intellectuals, as 21st century intellectuals, to the project of agenda setting across the globe for blackness?
Let me respond from both points, from the African point here, based on. Now I've been in universities for 4 decades, so I can speak from that
Both
experience. Okay. When I went to, in the 70s, if you went to do history at the University of Ghana, taught European economic history, they taught China, Asian history, they taught the history of the Soviet Union. You left and you were well trained as a historian. By the time you go back in the 90s, the training of historians had become very much like a national school. And there was a lot of national history of different, but if anything, regions, so it could be West Africa or it could be East Africa. But we had lost those international parts. And those were faculty who had trained in different countries around the world. So Kwekwedu taught China and Japan when I was an undergraduate. And he had trained in Asia. And he could speak the languages. And he knew his stuff. The one who taught me Russia had studied in the Soviet Union. We've lost that. And so even within our countries, our disciplines have become narrower, more provincial. In the US, if you're trained as a historian of Africa, even for a big university like Harvard, at most there will be 2 historians of Africa in the history department. A department with 50, 60 faculty. Are the 2 of you going to be faculty in your board. Small thing? And so you find out that it pushed us in 2 directions. We read everybody in the department to the point that I become quite familiar with American history, quite familiar with European history. I follow South Asia. I read, and you find out that, you know, there are insights for your work as a historian of Africa in ways that you did not
quite understand before you had engaged with this work.
And as we began to do that, we found out that we were writing in ways in which our colleagues were also using our works in their classes. Also to teach, because our work was now in conversation
with their context, with their experience.
We need to find a way to get back to these 2 situations. When I was taught to be a historian in ways that were so broad that when I showed up in the US to go and do a master's, the professors at Wake Forest asked, but can you do anything beyond African history? Up to now, the records I set in Wake Forest for the 3 semesters, I was the first person in 3 semesters to do a terminal master's. I did, 10 or 12 courses, I left with 12 A's. To the point that courses that had nothing to do with me, and this is the South. So to begin with, this is 1988. They still have issues believing that a black person can be smart.
Not only a black person,
much more one
and
from
Africa.
Much more one from Africa. And I remember one professor having an argument, and I had in the faculty, common room or that. Your subjects are cheap. If he comes to do the Old South, he will not get an A. So he invites me, do you want to do the Old South? I said, sure. And I had an A. By the time I left, the department had decided that 4 semesters was enough for a terminal master's. Those who had stayed beyond that, they should
conclude and get on with it.
Move on. The Africa had come to 10 expectations. But it was based on the training I had received at the University of Ghana. If I had been trained in the University of Ghana in the 1990s, I would have had a different
experience, yes. Yes.
When I speak to people I've trained who are in other universities, small universities, liberal arts colleges, they also find themselves the only historian of Africa in a department. So they're also reading everybody and writing in ways that engage
everybody.
Those are trends that are important, that we should find a way to recenter at our continent. Yes, there are private universities, but the state is a very important provider of funding. So the university I went to in the early 80s had been made possible by the government of Ghana. The state's importance, I know in the 1990s the state was dismissed, especially by international, but the state is too important. And somehow we need to find a way to rehabilitate the state in Africa. It is important to education. It is important to economic growth. The state is too important to be dismissed. And I think that as we think about the next couple of decades, a new Africa, the universities, we cannot take the state out as a key facilitator of that sort of future we are imagining.
Professor Akyeampong, thank you so much for not only a wonderful year at Harvard. I often say to a lot of my colleagues that we were in residence with that I thoroughly enjoyed our advisory meetings. And I think I shared this with you at some point where I said, going into a meeting with you is like going into confessional for those of us who are Catholic. It is a form of unburdening oneself. So I really just genuinely want to express appreciation and to also thank you for the moment that you've taken this morning to sit down with us and to chat. But also, I think, to reiterate the point that we came in with earlier, which is to say, you leave the Center for African Studies at Harvard University in an incredibly, incredibly healthy position. And for that, not only, I think, is Harvard grateful, but I believe the entire continent of Africa is incredibly grateful because as a result of the healthy position in which you leave the center, research that centers Africa, that concerns the life experiences of Africans, that concerns the realities of Africans, continues to be supported in exciting and innovative ways. For the fact that we are here today having this very conversation is as a result, it is a testament to itself to that. So I also wish to wish you well in terms of the next steps. Off camera, we have discussed some of the exciting new chapters that await you. But unfortunately, it seems that the hat of an administrator always follows you. And I suppose it is because you're good at it, at raising the money and doing the things that require doing in order to support exciting and innovative research. For our viewers at home, thank you very much for an exciting season. That has been the inaugural season of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. I am Siseko Kumalo, your host. There are rumblings of a season 2, so watch out and watch your screens. I'll see you soon. Thank you.